Thank you for inviting me to speak again at Heartland. I always look forward to it. And as I was picking out this topic for my sharing on this visit, I kept feeling like a character in a sitcom I saw recently, who was watching a show on climate change, and people said, "Why are you watching that?" And the character said, "Well, I can't find the remote to change the channel." And then the teenage daughter came by and said, "Ugh, climate change, I get it, we're all doomed," and left the room. I kept feeling like I wanted to change the channel of what was on my heart and mind and find something else to talk about. But then when I realized that I would be speaking just days after the anniversary of the Capitol insurrection, and as Omicron was spiking and I was going back into isolation, I realized I really can't not share where I've been going in my heart the past year about this stuff. So I hope you all don't want to change the channel as you're listening to me. So I've been feeling like we've entered what I'm calling the dark night of the planet. And I read a book in recent months by Dwayne Elgin called Choosing Earth. He's also got a Choosing Earth Project website. And it was a process of him imagining the future decades that we're heading into, in order to use imagination to maybe spur us to action a little faster than we tend to be going right now. And it was a hard book to read, but a very helpful book as well. And I found myself thinking about the three scenarios that he projects us to be entering into simultaneously, with the hope that we end up choosing the third of the three scenarios. So he talks about the Great Collapse as one of our pathways, a pathway of authoritarian control, and the pathway of great transition, which is the hardest of all for us to choose, because it involves choosing to mature as a species, to become adults instead of selfish adolescents like we've been behaving. And he sees those unfolding right now, and increasingly so in the coming decades. And I tend to agree. I feel the same way, that I feel those things happening right now. And as a trauma therapist, I see in the scenarios he's mapped out that we're responding to the multiple layers of crisis that we're dealing with in bodies that have nervous systems that respond with either collapse when they're overwhelmed, or fight and flight into some kind of more authoritarian type of control over self and world, or with our capacity for social engagement and connection and regulating together, which is collectively would be the path of great transition toward a resilient society that can be sustainable and take care of the earth. But sometimes I don't have a lot of hope that we can get past our reptilian brain and stop functioning in a kind of fight and flight collapse way as we have throughout history, and that we really truly can make that great transition, which is similar to the peace on earth, goodwill toward men longing that has been going through humanity for centuries, and was the longing of the early Christians. And sometimes I feel like, yeah, right, we'll never get there. But what I do turn to is a sense of, no matter what unfolds, what attitude am I going to bring to the situation? And what I keep coming to is the idea of keeping a vigil, that I'll be sitting through the dark night of the earth, praying, joining with others, trying to find ways to settle my own nervous system and be in a place of peace and connection, whatever unfolds. So I started to look into what is a vigil? How has it been done historically? How are we doing it right now? When I hear the word vigil, I think of, monks in the Middle Ages in the dark night going through some kind of liturgical practice. I think of soldiers doing a night watch, which was the original meaning of the word. I think of people sitting at the bedside of people who are sick or dying or even giving birth. And then I also think about the word vigilantes and how, unless we actually learn to kind of keep vigil with each other, we try to take matters into our own hands and think that we know the answers, and we turn into vigilantes instead of vigil keepers. So I want to share briefly with you, and I realize these are complex things that I could spend an entire time talking about one component, so I'll do my best to keep them compact. What are the actual pieces of what a traditional vigil keeping practice has, and how can we translate it into our own time and our own particular spiritual lives? So the components of a vigil were a practice of coming together in community after the experience of some kind of a rupture or an encounter with death, in order to be able to grieve together, and then sitting and waiting in a place of not knowing, which leads you to, because you're sitting there waiting and not knowing, you automatically then have to focus on yourself through an examination of your own conscious, and how you might live in better connection with community and with the sacred that you hold dear. And yet, even though it may feel like you are brought together by something that's hopeless, there's an undercurrent of hope and faith and love throughout the whole vigil process. And the real hope is that through the practice of the vigil keeping, you will learn how to return to the sacred as a community, as well as individually. So, and by sacred in our times, I think of the earth itself as the sacred that we need to return to, as well as respect of each other and a sense of community as sacred that we need to protect and preserve the bonds of community. So all of that kind of translates into a lot, I realize. We have to deal with our existential fear of death. The rupture pushes us into that place. So I turn to authors like Roshi Joan Halifax, who works in hospice as a Buddhist monk, and recognizes that this fear of death is one of the biggest things that we must confront, as does Buddhist monk and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh, who reminds us that it's normal to fear death. And I think about the death that we're causing as a society, who, with our existential fear of death, we want to avoid awareness of death. And we're producing endless number of consumer products promising a kind of deathless youth. And at the same time as doing that, we're sucking the earth dry and destroying our planetary life support system, basically killing Earth to give us the illusion of immortality. And I find help when I confront that. I find help returning to the classic work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who talks about the stages that people go through when they get their own diagnosis of a death-causing illness. Shock and denial and isolation and anger and bargaining and depression, acceptance and hope. And I've noticed all of those reactions happening in myself personally through the personal challenges I lived through over the past year, and also collectively, I see us all struggling through each of those stages multiple times. We don't finish one and leave it behind. We go through them again and again. So, and also, as I reflect on the idea of this rupture and death that we're going through, I'm noticing an increasing number of diagnostic terminology being given to us about what we're experiencing. Everything from eco-anxiety, global dread, climate anxiety, eco-paralysis, ecocide, to the term chronic traumatic planetary stress syndrome, which all of that brings up for me so much grief, immense amount of grief. It feels like I have to become immense in order to hold so much grief. So one author that was helpful to me to explore grief is Barbara Holmes, an African-American writer who talks about recovering the lost art of lament in her book, Crisis Contemplation. So a vigil involves us all collectively coming together to lament, to express the pain, to wail and keen and sob together, which I would like to see more of that out on our streets and in public places and in community gatherings, because lament is actually a challenge. Barbara Holmes says, a challenge to power structures, a call for justice. And it's hard to ignore when people are keening. It shakes you to the core. And one of my author mentors, Francis Weller, describes grief as a process of soul activism that allows us to register the sorrows that matter deeply to our souls. And that allows our hearts to stay flexible and fluid and open to the world, which instead of closing up and becoming hardened. The hardest part, I think, about vigil keeping might be the next two stages, the waiting in not knowing and the examination of consciousness. If you think about all the ways waiting drives you crazy, when the elevator isn't fast enough or the cars are going too slow through the intersection, waiting is a place of being in liminal space. And we don't sometimes know even if the waiting will end. It can be interminable, frustrating, uncomfortable, forced on us. It can feel cruel and lonely. But waiting can also feel freeing and creative and pregnant and surprising. We can be accompanied in the midst of our waiting. There can be camaraderie in the waiting. It can be ripe with opportunities, and it's where we find the turning points to unexpected paths. The difference between normal life waiting and vigil keeping waiting is that vigil keepers actually choose to wait. They go into the waiting purposefully as an intentional practice. And they've been doing that for millennia. Mystics and contemplatives have been waiting in places of unknowing as a spiritual practice for all of humans' spiritual life, I think. Because they know that only by going into that place of unknowing can they cultivate an open heart. So that willingness to wait in the unknowing with an open heart leads us to the place that I call the examination of consciousness. There's a practice from Ignatius of Loyola called the examen. And that's a place of really grappling with your own reactivity, all the ways that you resist life and go against your inner knowing, go against what you hold sacred, because you get defended or driven towards something that is not truly what you need or what truly serves your best purpose. It's really a place where you confront your existential anxiety, your feeling of trying to be in control when you're in the situation that you can't change and you can't control, which is what we all are dealing with right now. Collectively, the amount of existential anxiety that we're facing is increasing and ever changing. I know I felt that when Omicron popped out of the blue, and suddenly my fears and unknowings about how to function day to day changed again by these new situations with the virus. So the ultimate goal collectively of this examination of consciousness is to really see if we can grow into a species that is creative and caring and compassionate, and really uses that social engagement part of our nervous system to work together collectively to move through the challenging times that we face. And we do that because we love the earth and we love each other. And through the practice of the vigil keeping, we find more and more compassion for ourselves and each other. So the love grows. The love teaches us that is the whole purpose of our vigil, is to grow that compassion, to be that love. So the whole process of vigil keeping is actually a devotional act, a loving act. There's an anonymous medieval author who wrote something called The Cloud of Unknowing, who says that by the work of contemplative love, humanity will be healed. And that is the hope of the vigil keeper, even when it seems crazy, even when it seems like everybody else is running around as a vigilante, and why are we waiting with hope for the maturation of humanity? What else can we do? What other stance is sane to take is where I come to. And then through all of that, the vigil keeping teaches us that the sacred is actually present right now in the midst of the mess that we're in. Where we are right now is a place of choosing compassion, choosing the earth, choosing to love, choosing to hold out hope, choosing to do the hard psychological work of the examination of consciousness, all for the sake of not being passively waiting for change, but creatively participating in healing the soul of humanity and the world. So we are holding space, we're vessels of creativity, we're gestating the change and growth that is needed, and working to imagine the future. So the vigil keeper starts to see that the future that is needed is occurring in the present. We recognize our obligation to steward Earth is occurring right now. We recognize that we're stepping up to the collective effort and sacrifice that we need to choose. We move into great learning and deep humility in practicing that. So in the end, keeping a vigil was a way of growing seeds in the dark and feeling the healing quickening in silence. And realizing that what is sacred is never missing and never will be missing. It's present even in the darkest times. We can start to feel our own resilience, maturity, and compassion for our own suffering and for future times of struggle. And that is the salvation that we are looking for together. And as I've been thinking about all of this, I keep going back to one of my favorite mystics, Julian of Norwich. I worked at the Julian Center for 13 years, so I hold a dear place in my heart for Julian of Norwich, for which that place was named. And I've come to think of her life. She lived through the plague. So she's actually a mystic for our times, as what's his name? Matthew Fox, as Matthew Fox has pointed out in a new book. Julian of Norwich is a wonderful mystic for our times who lived through this similar kind of crazy stage of pandemic life. And at one point in her writings, she says, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." I think that is how keeping a vigil grounds us. And we start to feel that no matter what we're experiencing in this complex, great transition that we're trying to make, that we're keeping watch in love. And because of that, all things shall be well. So I hope you didn't want to change the channel. Thank you for listening to what's been on my heart and in my soul these recent months. And I see Heartland as a church that is a place holding vigil and working toward this great transition that we are trying to make. So thank you.